The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to the webinar and our speakers. Let me go over a few webinar housekeeping items. First, please click on the Raise Your Hand button on your screen to confirm that you can hear us. If you are having a problem with the audio transmission, you should send an email to the go-to address on your screen and a technician will assist you. Second, please note that except for presenters, everyone is muted throughout the duration of this call. Third, there will be a question and answer session following the presentations by our two speakers. You can submit questions throughout the presentations and during the question and answer session by typing them in the question box on the right-hand side of your screen. All questions submitted are anonymous, and questions posed to presenters will be selected from the full list of questions submitted, including those that were submitted prior to today. It's unlikely that we will be able to answer all questions today. Responses to any questions we can't answer today will be posted at a later date on Nonprofit Finance Fund's Social Impact Bond website, the address for which we will post at the end of the webinar. The topic of today's webinar is First Mover States. What are they doing and why? The spotlight on Pay for Success financing has focused on social impact bonds, the innovative financing structure implemented in the United Kingdom and developed by Social Finance. As we saw in our last webinar, policymakers around the world are developing ways to adapt financing structures like the social impact bond to their own local context. In the U.S., two state governments have taken the lead, Massachusetts and Minnesota. Today, we'll be hearing from Greg Menis, Assistant Secretary for Finance and Infrastructure in the Massachusetts Executive Office for Administration and Finance, and Steve Rothschild, Founder and President of Invest in Outcomes, which is piloting Minnesota's program. They'll share with us what factors led them to take their respective approaches to Pay for Success financing, what their approaches involve, the current status of their efforts, and what they hope to accomplish. Let me now turn the program over to Greg Menis to talk about what's happening in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
The goals for the discussions we see in the first slide are first to acknowledge the work that's been done to date on social impact bonds and related concepts, and then second to share Massachusetts' perspective on social innovation financing, which is based on this foundation. As I said before, but you may not have heard, on the first point, I think we have the benefit of past webinars, research, work in the field by people like Steve. So I'm not going to spend too much time going through the mechanics of social impact bonds and other structures, since that has been pretty well communicated to date, but rather focus on Massachusetts' perspective related to this project. And we've really landed on two objectives, one of which is to focus on a small list of pilot programs under the heading of social innovation financing, which is the term that we use to describe social impact bonds, Pay for Success contracts, and similar financing tools. And number two, our ongoing effort to align this initiative with other policy initiatives in the area of long-term planning and performance management. As an overview for the discussion, I'll touch briefly on the challenges to social innovation, the manner in which social impact bonds respond to those challenges, our focus on the broader perspective of what we call social innovation financing. I'll talk a little bit about the request for information, the RFI status, and next steps, and also describe some of the challenges and opportunities that we see going forward. Can I go back a slide? Yeah, okay. I think one of the most helpful aspects of this project is that it has helped us to synthesize problems that we already knew we had, but maybe weren't able to communicate as effectively as we might have liked. At a high level, we describe these as the key challenges to social innovation and focus on three issues. Number one, the government funding is insufficiently focused on results and performance. All of us are working hard to do a better job of that, but we also know we have more work to be done. Number two, which I think is the central insight of the social impact bond discussion, is that performance-based funding requires upfront investments and the ability to absorb risk, but public organizations are wary of failure. In the private sector, if you're right 9 out of the 10 times, your name is probably Warren Buffett and you're on the cover of Fortune magazine. In the public sector, as many of us know, if you're right 9 out of 10 times, it's the 10th thing that finds its way into the newspapers. And as a result, I think it's very reasonable that public officials have a certain risk aversion in terms of pursuing new and innovative projects. And we think that social impact bonds and similar vehicles provide a solution to that. The third issue is that preventative programs often don't get funded out of the budgets they help reduce. One example that we've looked very closely at is providing better services to homeless individuals. One of the benefits we expect to get from that is lower medical costs over the long term. But I think, as many of us know, most government programs are viewed on a siloed basis, and so that is yet another barrier to social innovation. So these challenges, I think, are three themes that we'll come back to consistently during the presentation. On the next slide, we have our version of a diagram that I think everyone has probably seen before. In the interest of time, I'll just walk through it very quickly, going clockwise, starting from the government box on the lower right, just to make 3 points. Number one, just to remind ourselves that the essential ingredients for any of these projects is, first and foremost, that we have an innovative program to pursue, and secondly, that it's supported by a pay-for-success contract. The second feature of this particular diagram in the lower left corner is that we have collapsed the service providers and intermediaries into what we describe as a social innovation partnership. That is not intended to diminish the role of intermediaries, which we expect to be very important, but rather to do two things. Number one, re-emphasize the point that the essential ingredient is the pay-for-success contract innovative program. And number two, to acknowledge that there may be some projects that don't require the third feature of this diagram, which are the social investors. And that pay-for-success contracts is something that we can continue to try to do better on a standalone basis in government. The third feature in the upper left corner, the social investors, as we just described on the last page, is essential to certain projects where there's a need for additional capital to achieve the risk allocation that we talked about. The insights that we gleaned from this analysis were threefold. Number one, we view SIBS as a promising new financing tool to address the challenges to social innovation. Number two, that other tools also exist, including pay-for-success contracts, as we just described. And number three, that social innovation financing is closely aligned with performance management and long-term planning initiatives. As I mentioned at the outset of the program, our second objective here is to make sure that all of the insights we gain from this whole process are things that we can replicate as far and wide as possible across state government. In the course of our research, we looked at several live projects in the field. Some of them include the UK Peterborough Prison, which is the classic social impact bond project, the Maryland Opportunity Compact, something that's going on right here in Massachusetts at Mass General Hospital. They have a program for intensive case management for the most expensive Medicare cases, and the hospital and the doctors organization has taken on some risk in a pay-for-success arrangement. And of course, Minnesota, Twin Cities Rise, and other examples that Steve is going to be talking about. When we looked at these different projects and attempted to decompose the features, we came across three issues. Number one, programs that emphasize rigorous performance measurement and payment based on success. Number two, leveraging public-private partnerships to provide startup funding and reduce taxpayer risk. And three, creating incentives for improving performance and furthering innovation across government. I think the two key points I'd like to make on this slide are, number one, that we're essentially restating the manner in which different social innovation financing programs resolve the common challenges to social innovation that we talked about up front. And that number two, the different programs don't necessarily have to include all the different features of these common attributes. As we talked about before, it may be the case that simply doing a more intensive, focused, better job on pay-for-success contracts, something we've already been pursuing at a smaller level today, would certainly be successful in our efforts on social innovation financing. This next slide talks a little bit about our second objective, which is to align our efforts on social innovation financing with other policy initiatives here at the Commonwealth. From a long-term planning perspective, I think that provides important context to why innovative financing techniques are important. As many of us know, government resources over the past several years have been severely diminished coming out of the recession and as a result of increased healthcare cost inflation. And I think this really prompts us and reminds us that we do in fact need to find different ways for governments to operate in order to provide services with dwindling resources. The second point is something we're trying to be more explicit about in terms of internal alignment, and that is viewing social innovation financing as an extension of our existing performance management initiatives. To a certain degree, it provides something akin to a venture capital role within government, and that it's focused on projects that require longer evaluation periods and require greater risk. And we've also come to recognize in exploring programs that the Social Innovation Financing Initiative ought to help us accelerate our efforts on performance management. So in one of the projects that we were exploring as it relates to recidivism for ex-prisoners, we're coming to learn that we may not have as much management information and solidity in performance metrics as we might like to look at the effects of different programs for people coming out of different prisons. So to that extent, were we to pursue something as part of our RFI within the corrections world, it ought to prompt us to develop better management information, invest a little bit in technology, and as I state in the presentation here, really force us to continue to push the agenda on performance management. As it relates to the request for information, we issued something on May 6th to gather input from interested parties. The responses are due tomorrow, and we're really excited about the process so far. That RFI emphasized social impact bonds and pay for success contracts. Homelessness and corrections were identified as possible pilot programs. We spent a fair amount of time internally trying to suss out which projects and programs might be best suited, and we focused on those in our RFI but left it open to other recommendations. Our intent is to issue a request for response later this year for targeted programs, and along the way we're carefully analyzing what legislation may be required to accomplish that. And as I've talked about several times, we have an ongoing effort to align social innovation financing with performance management here at the Commonwealth. In terms of challenges and opportunities, I think there are three key challenges that we're focused on. First and foremost is identifying projects with some proof of concept and strong likelihood to succeed. This again is a reminder that all of the different innovative financing tools we expect to be exceptionally helpful, but the important essential ingredient is to find initiatives that we think are going to work and have some proof of concept from past efforts. The second is ensuring credible processes for measurement and the sharing of risk reward. This gets to some of the issues that you all discussed in past webinars. And then balancing the needs of specific pilot programs with a desire to reap benefits across government. And this again is a careful balance we're trying to play of being somewhat entrepreneurial in pursuing pilot programs, but also recognizing that we want to find solutions that we can institutionalize and really change the way government works on a broader scale. That gets us to the opportunities, which are twofold. Accelerating the emphasis on performance measurement, and I gave an example of that early in the presentation. And then secondly, institutionalizing an approach that will have a sustainable and significant impact across government. And I think that represents really what we're trying to accomplish over the long term, where it is our hope that through several pilot programs we'll demonstrate success on different ways of running government programs, but simultaneously take advantage of the learnings and insights from that to really have a significant and meaningful impact on our ability to provide more with the resources that we have available to us in the future. That concludes my presentation. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you, Greg. Let me now turn over the program to Rothschild to talk about what's happening in Minnesota.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. My name is Steve Rothschild, and I'm pleased to be able to tell you about what we are doing in Minnesota, about what we call the Human Capital Performance Bond, or HUCAP. The purpose of this financing tool is twofold. First, to increase in an incremental way the investment that is available for the highest performing social providers, of course, mostly nonprofits in the state. And secondly, to improve the productivity of social spending by rewarding those highest performers. This is the agenda I'm going to follow. I'm going to talk a little bit about what factors and experiences led us to take this approach, why this particular approach was taken and chosen, what the status is and what the plans are, and like Greg earlier, a bit about the concerns and hopes that we have. This chart shows a 25-year forecast of revenue and expenses for the state of Minnesota by major category, developed by the Minnesota State Long-Term Economic Commission under the direction of the state economist. It was initially issued in 2008. It was updated in 2010 with very little change. And what you can see is that healthcare costs are growing at more than twice the rate of revenues. And if one keeps K through 12 spending constant with inflation, all other spending in the state must decline by close to 4% a year in order to have a balanced budget, which is a requirement of the Constitution. Now, all other includes the entire higher ed system, early childhood, treatment programs, workforce development programs, environmental programs, and even the filling of potholes, something that's quite important in our state. In point of fact, if this were to materialize, healthcare costs would go from 30% of the state budget to 60% of the state budget. And with education, K through 12 education representing 40% of the state budget, it means literally that there would be no money left for anything else. Anything else represented, or all other represented, $6 billion per year in 2010. Now, we don't expect it to go to zero, but observers would suggest that we could have a $2 to $3 billion problem per year. And this cannot be made up by the federal government or philanthropy alone, because the assets of all the foundations in Minnesota aren't sufficient to do that. The second consideration in taking this approach is the experience of a nonprofit in Minnesota, which I actually founded in 1994, called Twin Cities Rise. And there we've had a successful pay-for-performance contract with the state since 1997, which is a statute in law. And it's based on the economic value established by the creation of higher tax receipts and lower government subsidies from the increase in income that Twin Cities Rise, or quite frankly any organization that's successful, would create by virtue of its social intervention. And in this case, the state economists determined that a $10,000 increase in income from $10,000 to $20,000 would create $3,800 in cash per year, with a present value of $31,000. This was done in 1995. Over the last 13 years that this has been in effect, the actual present value is $50,000, since the change in income has been greater. And Twin Cities Rise is paid $9,000 at placement and $9,000 at retention a year later, if in fact there's a success. So Twin Cities Rise takes all the risk and only is paid for success. The state has reaped a 624% return over this period of time. What we conclude from both the macro picture of the state forecast and the Twin Cities Rise example is that there are, number one, major structural problems that aren't being addressed in the state and aren't being dealt with by the legislature and the governor at this time looking forward. And that even though one can have a successful pay-for-performance model that creates economic value for the state, it hasn't led to sufficient change in the way the state allocates resources. We need new investors and new investment to fill this gap and also to reward the best performers. And that's the intention of the Human Capital Performance Bond. It's a market rate, AA bond that funds high-performance human services. We believe, after vetting this, that this will be of interest to private investors, financial institutions of all kinds, particularly banks, because they will qualify for CRA, or Community Reinvestment Act credit, seeking a market rate of return. And that social investors like foundations have already expressed interest because they can get a market rate on their endowment and align it with their mission. And of course it works in the same way the Twin Cities Rise model did, that the economic return of the providers exceeds the state's cost of borrowing in the first place. It works very similar to the way any bond works. The state sells the bonds, it receives the cash proceeds. In this case, it goes into a performance pool. And providers are rewarded when they create value. That can be seen on the next diagram. Starting on the right side of the slide, the government would sell the bond to external investors, receive the cash, and put it in a performance pool. At the same time, high return nonprofits would be certified for participation based on their ability to demonstrate that their results lead to economic value above the state's cost of capital. For those organizations that require working capital in order to implement this, because they only get paid upon their performance, we are developing a working capital pool from PRIs and bank CDCs. As the organizations perform, they get paid. And at that time, the state is already accumulating value by virtue of higher tax revenues, sales and income taxes, and lower public subsidy payments for things like low-income child care, low-income health care, low-income housing, and the like, and also more direct payments like the savings in the corrections budget. The importance of this model, and the most important point, is that we will be following individuals that are dealt with by these providers through their Social Security numbers, provided we get a waiver from them. And that the state would be following their Social Security numbers to indicate whether their tax receipts went up and their use of public subsidies went down. And it would be the ability to track this and to book it into the budgets that receive the benefit, like the revenue budget and the human services budget and the correction budget, and capture that in the finance division and use those savings to pay the interest and amortize the debt. It's our expectation that, based on our modeling so far, that these high-performing nonprofits can create returns above the state's cost of capital and provide extra cash or a positive arbitrage for the state. So why did we choose a market rate instrument in this manner? What I've provided is our kind of view of the continuum of social investing. And starting on the left side, we have no financial return required. Where billions of dollars are invested today, and there's no real cost of capital as a result of that. And the obvious examples are government appropriations and philanthropy, which still remain and will remain a major source, the most important source for social purposes. The second tranche you can see there is below market returns, where only millions of dollars, as we understand it, are being invested. And the cost of capital is relatively high because the risk falls entirely on the investor. And examples here are social venture capital, program-related investments, and social impact bonds, as we view and understand that particular financial instrument. And then finally, the third area is market rate return investing, where trillions of dollars are invested. The cost of capital is relatively low, and it's primarily in the social context used by governments, both at the federal and the state and the local level, to sell bonds for primarily building and buying equipment. And we would put the human capital performance bond in this category. The reason we chose to go market rate is because, number one, we believe more nonprofits can qualify with a low cost of capital than with a high cost of capital. The hurdle rate will be lower. Number two, there's a greater investment pool available. There are trillions of dollars invested in market rate instruments. And third, there is a cost-effective, proven infrastructure to distribute bonds in this country, and really in other countries as well, which would enable this idea to scale up and to grow quickly if it were to prove successful. At this time, the legislature in Minnesota passed the bond provision in its government finance bill, but it was vetoed by the governor for unrelated reasons. But the governor in its veto letter indicated that he has interest in pursuing the HUCAP should he receive a bill that he's satisfied with on other matters. We've had a group of economists doing analysis in this arena to find areas and programs that would qualify and exceed the cost of capital of the state. And we've already completed that in the workforce area, and we have found a number of programs that would easily meet that criteria. We are now in the process of doing the same analysis in adult daycare, supportive housing, addiction treatment, and disability employment. And we chose those areas because there's a fair amount spent. There's good literature to show good cost-benefit analysis, and we believe we can find organizations within the state that are capturing data that could be helpful here. We believe there are other important areas that could yield even greater returns in healthcare and education, but they're too politicized to take on as our first attempt. We're also developing an evaluation protocol, and we are starting to work with the agencies of the state, foundations, banks, and businesses to develop the execution of this particular idea. Our plans are to pass the law, although we don't have much control over that at this point, to finalize all the economics, the bond structure, the pilot areas, to determine and to get agreement with the state on the technical and contractual terms, and to do a little bit more fundraising to support the development and evaluation of this, which has all been funded by foundations in the state and businesses, and obviously to execute the pilot. Our concerns and hopes. The first concern is the largest concern, and that is to ensure the fidelity of the model. And by that I mean we need to be able to track individuals and to determine their use, whether their tax payments are going up, for example, or their use of subsidies are going down, and that we can capture that and we can book it, and then we can use that cash to pay the interest and the principal. If we can't do that, this is not going to work. We also want to ensure that this doesn't get politicized, and so we've, in the statute that's been proposed, we have set up a organizational structure that tries to separate it as far as possible from political meddling. Although we recognize that only can go so far. The second concern is brought up by particularly some liberal Democrats, and that is their concern that conservatives will use this device to supplant rather than to supplement appropriations, which is its intention. Our hopes, obviously, are to pass the law and execute the pilot in early 2012, to demonstrate the feasibility in many human service areas as we develop the underlying economics, and to provide our learning to other organizations, states, municipalities who are interested in learning more and perhaps pursuing the same kind of idea. So that concludes my remarks.
Thank you, Steve. Now let's go to the question and answer session. And let me begin with the question for Greg Menis. And so, Greg, the first question is, what are the outstanding issues that need to be resolved to make your social impact bond proposition feasible?
I think there's probably 4 pieces to it, and those might be identifying the right projects, ensuring credible measurement, getting access to capital if and when we need it, and the last part would be legislation. I think all of those issues require hard work and partnership inside and outside state government. But I think based on our work to date, I would go back to issue number 1, which is identifying good projects. And one of the things we alluded to in our presentation is that we just need to be careful not to get caught in the mechanics of all the different financing vehicles, although we think they're great, and just focus on the idea of making sure we're working with the right stakeholders inside and outside government to find good projects where we can make upfront investments to generate preventative type savings over long periods of time.
Thanks, Greg. Steve, we have one for you. And that question is it feasible under the Minnesota model to raise money in the bond market when specific programs aren't identified?
Well, the short answer is yes. And the reason is that we've designed the bond to be a plain vanilla bond. And by that I mean that the bondholders are really only concerned about getting interest payments and getting their principal back. And since the state has a moral obligation to do that, they're not as concerned about the mechanism by which the state is paid. That is the state's concern as to whether the mechanics of the pay-for-performance model work in the way that it is designed. Now, we had a choice to use a different approach here, and that is to provide more risk and more opportunity for return to bondholders by taking some of the risk. But we chose not to do that because that would be an unusual kind of bond, and as a new idea, they wouldn't know how to assess the risk, and therefore the cost of capital would go up dramatically. And that was one thing we wanted to prevent. So the answer is no, they're not going to be concerned about the nature of the organizations involved. That is the state's concern.
Thanks, Steve. The next question actually probably could be answered by both of you, so why don't we give it to Greg first and then we'll go to Steve. But the question is, can you just articulate who assumes the financial risk in your structure? The state, the investors, service providers, or another party? Want to attack that first, Greg?
Sure. I think in our model, depending on whether, let's look at two examples. In a pay-for-success contract, it would be the service provider or the social innovation partnership that we described. I think that the fundamental idea behind a pay-for-success contract is just that. If delivery is not achieved, then payments aren't made. I should note that it's a reasonable expectation that the payments the government make would be, some composition of ongoing payments for certain services with a pay-for-success component to it as well. But to answer your question directly, in that case of the pay-for-success contract, it will be the delivery provider. And then if you go the second step where, for example, the service provider doesn't have the operating capital or other expertise necessary to enter into such an agreement, the social investor would be expected to bear a significant portion of the risk that's associated with the pay-for-success aspect of the contract.
Thanks, Greg. How about you, Steve?
Well, in this model, the primary risk is taken by the service provider, secondary risk by the state, and tertiary risk by the bondholder. And that was designed this way principally to keep the cost of capital low for the reasons that I cited before. One has to remember that this is for incremental investment. It doesn't affect the current appropriation that these organizations would currently get under different circumstances. And there are two things mitigating against the risk that the providers have working for them. Number one, they have to demonstrate that they can get returns above the cost of capital before they'll be allowed to play in the pool, so to speak. And as a result, the risks to them of failure are relatively low, since they've been able to demonstrate this in the past. And secondly, we will be providing working capital to organizations, particularly that need it. And in the pilot, it's likely that it will be non-recourse loans because we want to incentivize organizations to participate. The state has a bit of risk, and that is that if it doesn't work, they have to close down the bond and call the bond, and they're going to have some costs, but they're going to be de minimis. And of course, the risk of the bondholder is that this bond is an annual appropriation bond, not a general obligation bond. And by that, I mean it is not legal tender of the state. And so legally, the state doesn't have to pay back these bonds or pay its interest, but they do as a matter of moral obligation, and they're used in the marketplace in various states. It's the reason it's a AA bond and not a AAA bond, and so their cost is a little bit higher on the interest, but there are many of these things sold, and Minnesota has issued them many times in the past.
Thanks, Steve. Greg, we've got one for you here. And this question is, how will the Commonwealth overcome one-year budget cycles to make agreements that span multiple years?
I think that's a great question, and honestly, something that we're just in the exploratory phase and thinking about it. But one way to think about it might be that existing government processes essentially require that the government set aside money for programs and services where they have an obligation to pay upon performance. And to a certain degree, any contract we enter into has performance aspects of it, where we would have recourse, perhaps the ability not to pay if certain performance features were not met. So if, for example, we had a 3- or 5-year project cycle and there were performance-based payments that would not be paid out until years 3, 4, and 5, again, just for example, it is likely that we would have to go through a process whereby we officially appropriated funds, set them aside, and I put that in quotes because I don't necessarily mean putting cash in a trust account, although that may be a solution, and had the money available to make the payments upon success of the project. So in that way, to a certain degree, the funds would still need to be budgeted in the same way they are today. It's just that the emphasis on performance and success would hopefully be much more intense than it's been in the past.
Thanks, Greg. We have one here, which is, given your commentary on kind of measuring performance and ROI and things of that sort, are there technology solutions for measuring performance of the programs financed through social financing? And what have you used if that's the case?
Well, the measurement, if I understand the question correctly, we're basically using the same measurement tools across all areas and organizations. And that is, what is the return on investment, number one, what is the present value of that return, and what is the cash flow? And these are tools that are used in commerce and in government today, more so in the world of commerce, of course. But in effect, what you need is to find out what are the new revenues, and they're typically taxes, increases in taxes, sales and income taxes, and what are the savings, and those are typically cost avoidance in entitlements. And so it's a matter of collecting the data correctly and then just using those standardized approaches that have been used for hundreds of years. So this is not using new technology in that regard. The key to it is getting good information that is accurate. I hope I've dealt with the question if I understood it correctly.
No, I think you have. Thanks.
I just made a comment about the last question that you asked Greg.
Go ahead.
One of the benefits of a bond is we don't have to worry about the 2-year budget cycle. The money is provided by investors, and private money is more patient than government money. So you don't have 2 years to demonstrate in which you have to demonstrate some kind of output. It's really tough to get an outcome in 2 years anyway. But in this case, the bond is probably going to be around a 10-year bond. And so this is going to enable nonprofits who participate to make more strategic decisions about how to allocate resources in a way to get higher returns without being concerned about demonstrating higher returns in a very short period of time.
Thanks, Steve. Greg, we've got a question here for you, which is when Greg was showing his diagram, he talked about possibility of being able to move forward without the social investors. Is his thought that the government can pay directly for upfront services with performance goals to save themselves money on the back end?
No, I think that's a great question, and I think that the hypothetical example would be that there was a service provider that was sufficiently well capitalized that they could afford to enter into an arrangement where there might be a 3 or 5 year evaluation period and essentially wait out the measurement process until they receive the pay for success payments from the government. So in that particular case, I would not expect there to be any difference in behavior or the timing of payment from the government, but instead the risk would be retained by the service provider. And I think, again, we're trying to emphasize the point that the essential ingredients of any of these projects are having a good program and having a high-octane, performance-based pay-for-success contract. The social investors come into play for a couple of reasons, which include providing capital to service providers and nonprofits, many of whom simply don't have the expertise or the ability to operate a business for 3 or 5 years while we're waiting for the measurement to be completed.
Thanks, Greg. Steve, another one for you here. This question is, will these bonds compete for investors in the usual municipal bond market, and how do you anticipate them faring competitively?
Well, they'll compete with AA bonds across the board, as my underwriters tell me. What you've got to remember is this will be a relatively small percentage of the municipal bonds that are being sold in any state or across the country. I think Minnesota has about $3 billion worth of bonds out at any one time. We're starting with $20 million as a pilot, but if we were to be successful, and let's say this went up to 20 or 30 times that, it still would be a relatively small percentage. The fact of the matter is there's a lot of money today being invested at 1% that's looking for a higher yield, and we would expect that these would fare quite well if we can demonstrate in a pilot that they have fidelity.
Thanks. Greg, one for you now. Lots of questions. And next question is, do you think there is a way social impact bonds can work if the government only pays back the principal?
I think that's an interesting question, and I would really go back to the idea that from the government's perspective, what our intent would be to do is pay for services to the extent that we believe those services have value to the government. And so I think what the question is probably getting at is what rate of return might social investors require? Potentially the question is getting to the issue of optics that a lot of people have raised in the past, that taxpayers may have concerns about investors making money on the back of the government in terms of those payments. So I think the answer to the question really should focus on the government is going to pay what it deems to be an appropriate price for services rendered. And on the back end, the agreement between the service provider and the social investors is something we expect to be engaged with and aware of, but is not necessarily part of our contract from a service perspective. So to the extent that kind of arrangement could be worked out and there would be no rate of interest, which essentially means you might have a foundation providing a grant, not making an investment in a service provider, I don't see why we would have any reason for that. I think the manner in which that deviates from the hypothesis around social impact funds is that social investors, and I'll use foundations as an example, the hypothesis is that the social investors will find it very attractive to enter into an arrangement where they can pursue their mission objectives, but also feel like there is market discipline based into the agreement. So as a result, I think the answer would be certainly that could work from the government's perspective, but I'm not sure that that would accomplish what we think can be accomplished by letting social investors, foundations, and the like feel like they're entering into an agreement that has the market-based discipline of, success-based payments and some idea of getting a return on the money they put into a project.
Thank you, Greg. Steve, another question for you here, which is what will be the source of funds for the government to repay the human capital bonds if the nonprofit is not successful?
Well, in this model, if the nonprofit is not successful, the government pays nothing out. You got to remember, much like the Massachusetts model, as I understand it, it's a pay for performance or pay for success contract that is established here. So if there is no performance, there is no payment, and the bond money remains in the performance pool until such a time that the government decides this is not working, and they call the bond and they pay it back. And the only cost to the government is a little bit of interest during the period of time that they've borrowed the money. But the principal hasn't been paid out. Our expectation is that that's exactly why we want to pilot it. We want to see whether our vetting, if you will, of organizations to determine whether their past experience is a good prologue for exceeding hurdle rate will prevent that. But the fact of the matter is that if there is no performance, there is no payment, and the government closes down the entire performance pool.
Thanks, Steve. Greg, back to you. We have another one, which is, in your view, what do you see as the role for philanthropy in the way that you're moving forward with both pay for success contracts and SIB as possible opportunities?
I think that one of the expected roles of philanthropy, and again to use the example of a foundation, would be to play the role of what we would call an impact-first investor. And I think as I described answering the last question, the foundation in the role of an impact-first investor would be an organization that wants to pursue their mission but finds it very attractive to enter into an arrangement where market discipline is part of the process and where rigor has gone into setting up performance metrics. So on the one hand, it provides an attractive way for there to pursue their mission and make investments in certain projects. On the other hand, I think the expectation is that those sorts of investors would have different rates of return requirements than you might see on Wall Street or in the marketplace in general. And to be very direct about it is that they may not necessarily expect a market-based return. And to kind of put some numbers on that, if you think about innovative social programs in the same way you think about venture capital in the private sector, there's a reasonable likelihood that some of those programs won't succeed. In the market, that leads to very high rate of return requirements in the area of 30%, for example, which I think gets into an area of complexity and financial challenges that we're not sure is going to be viable in this model. So the foundation playing the role of the impact-first investor would look for a rate of return as part of their agreement, but not something I think that we would otherwise expect private investors to be seeking. So I think that provides an important source of both capacity and social commitment to the project.
Thanks, Greg. Steve, a question for you here, which is, one of the aspects of social impact bonds that is often spoken to is the fact that it aligns interest of investors, service providers, and the government in their structure. And the question for you is about the structure for the human capital bonds, which is, don't we want the bondholders to care about the programs? Given that that's sort of a key component of the structure of social impact bonds, how do you respond to that about human capital bonds?
Well, I don't think it's personally a requirement of making these things work. If you look at our objectives, the objective is to provide incremental investment for social providers and to improve the return, the productivity, the effectiveness of those providers. And if we can accomplish that with market rate investors who have virtually all of the money then we still have accomplished our objective. There will be social investors. There's nothing to prevent social investors, and we, quite frankly, expect social investors to invest in this for that purpose, because they can get a market rate of return and align with their own interest, with their own mission. But we don't want to restrict it to social investors, because that's a much smaller group of investors, and that will make it much more difficult to scale this up in major projects across various states.
Thanks, Steve. We have another question here for Greg. We're getting close to the end of our Q&A time, so I'm going to try to pick out the ones that I think are kind of most engaging. For Greg, the question here is, are you making a clear distinction between the funding function of an intermediary and the operating function? Can they be different entities?
I think the answer is yes. We would make a clear distinction. The way that we have thought about this and talked about talked with some of the thought leaders is that the intermediary would essentially fill both of those roles. Number one, coordinating investment, and number two, providing a certain level of sophisticated expertise on establishing performance measurement and entering into a sophisticated contract. But I think there's no reason why those couldn't be two separate entities, if that would make sense. Obviously, that adds to complexity if you bring more parties to the table, but we do view those functions differently, so they could be responded to differently.
Thanks, Greg. Steve, back to you again, one for you, which is, it looks like the Minnesota model is focused exclusively on nonprofit providers, given the use of municipal bond market proceeds, et cetera. And the question there is, does that eliminate the sort of possibility of for-profit providers who may be equally, if not more efficient and effective in providing services from participating in the program?
It does not. It's available to all social providers, unions, potential for-profits, and nonprofits. But we expect the largest group to be nonprofits.
Thanks. We have a couple of questions on measurements here that I want to get to, maybe possibly to both of you. But one of those questions is, how do you anticipate setting measurement baselines and metrics for success, and what are the greatest challenges and pitfalls? I guess I'll go to Greg first on that.
I think that you know, and again, Steve will have some additional insight from, you know, experience in the field on this. I think the critical issue that we've landed on in thinking about performance is balancing the need to be both rigorous while also being practical about it. I think in the Peterborough prison example, and based on some of the research and conversations that we've had, you know, my understanding is that they landed on what was a very thoughtful approach to look at a single high-level metric around recidivism, and could easily explain why that was a relevant and key indicator of a very rigorous thought process on demonstrating success. So I think that's a good example of what we understand to be a project where there was a lot of effort and analysis put into coming up with the right measures, but the conclusion on the back end was to come up with something that was not only credible, but also, you know, kind of easy to point to. I think another consideration that we've talked about in that same context is that there are, from a budgetary perspective, it is our expectation that certainly in the initial stages, these projects will represent a very small portion of the total state's budget. So while it's important to be able to credibly point to the manner in which the projects are generating savings, I think it's also important not to become obsessed with some idea of reconciling every dollar back to every line item in every budget, you know, over the next 5 or 10 years. So from our perspective, I think getting rigorous, credible measurement from the appropriate outside parties, academics, and so forth is critical. And then we just make sure we need to balance that with something that people can understand, which will help us really apply it to other areas in state government.
Thanks, Greg. Steve, what's your response?
Well, we're going to be looking at 4 primary measurements of success, which require that you collect accurate data, as I said. And one of the examples is the one that Greg just used, is in some of these cases, recidivism is a big component of savings. So the first criteria is, what is the return on investment of the project? Number 2, is the cash flow generated by the participating providers sufficient to pay the cost of debt service for the bond? Number 3, is there going to be interest on the part of investors? Number 4, will there be continuing interest on the part of providers? And that it'll be as much a function of whether the payments that they receive for the benefit that they create are sufficient to cover their costs. And it's our hope that they will exceed their costs and that they will invest what margin they receive back into the development of their own programs.
Thanks. Now this is going to close out the Q&A session of the webinar, and I want to thank both Greg Menace and Steve Rothschild for really terrific batch of information coming to us both in the presentations and in the Q&A session. And I want to thank everyone who attended for participating in today's webinar. I want everyone to know that slides from today's webinar will be posted on the Nonprofit Finance Fund's Social Impact Bond Paid for Success Project website tomorrow, June 10. The full video and audio recording of the webinar will be posted on Monday, June 13. And answers to questions you submitted that we weren't able to get to today will be posted on the website as soon as possible once we can get Steve and Greg to spend some time answering them. And as the slide on the screen indicates, for more information on these topics discussed in the webinar here today, please visit our newly redesigned website at www.nffsib.org, and you can also visit us at www.paidforsuccess.org. Thank you all very much. Have a great weekend.